I remember.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone, and thank you for opening with a song. We as youth defenders and advocates, this is our job to try to make things right. So we are here today and excited to have all of you join us from wherever you are, sending out special love and thoughts to our colleagues in Puerto Rico today as they struggle with the impact of Fiona and everyone who's being impacted by this storm today. But we're grateful to have all of you with us this afternoon to join us for our 7th session in our 2022 Racial Justice Training Series. As many of you know, in each of our sessions this year, we've explored a chapter from Professor Henning's book, Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And all of you, youth defenders, impacted young people, advocates, social workers, decision makers, have joined us to discuss how the impact of government systems and societal bias on Black and Latino and other groups has impacted the development of young people. You've heard conversations about young people's right to play, about adolescent development. And today we're excited to focus on chapter 7 of Chris's book, Contempt of Cop. Today we're going to launch a conversation about how the over-surveillance and over-policing of adolescents, most especially Black, Latino, and Indigenous young people, has seeded fear and resentment among young people, and how we as youth defenders and youth advocates to help support youth voices and responses to both keep them free and safe and provide pathways for their leadership and their transformation of these harmful systems. So we're going to start today with brief introductions. And then we're going to invite each of our panelists to talk with us for 60 seconds about why they're passionate about this. Why are they passionate about advocating to lift up young people's voices and keep them safe, of course, in these interactions with law enforcement? So we're going to start with our colleague, our friend, our expert, our author, Professor Henning from Georgetown University. As I hope all of you know, Chris is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Center and Initiative at Georgetown Law. Chris has represented young people in DC for over 3 decades. Can that be possible? She's inspired and taught countless numbers of advocates, defenders, and others across the country. She trains a wide array of professionals across the country on the role of race in the juvenile legal system. And of course, she's the author of Rage of Innocence. Chris, can we start with you? And in 60 seconds, can you tell us why you are passionate about advocating for youth's right to be children and react like children in police encounters?
Yes, thank you so much, Marianne, and for everybody coming out. I am absolutely passionate about this conversation because our children have grown up seeing so much harm done by aggressive policing and hyper surveillance in Black and Latino communities. And so any Black or brown child with an ounce of self-worth, an ounce of dignity and humanity should resist the negative labels that have been forced upon them and the unwanted intrusions they have been enforced to endure. So we should expect them to react just like children when they encounter police.
Thank you so much, Chris. And another strong advocate in our community. We're so excited to be joined by Duci Goncalves, the Deputy Chief Counsel of the Youth Advocacy Division and the Youth Defender Branch of the Committee for Public Counsel Services, which is really the Massachusetts Public Defender Office. Prior to becoming the Deputy Chief Counsel, Duci was attorney in charge of the Yad Quincy office. And she's been a public defender and a youth defender since 2005. She also served as a professor of law in Suffolk University's Juvenile Justice Center, representing young people and assisting in the teaching of the Juvenile Defender Clinic. Duci, like all of you on this screen, is the recipient of numerous awards. We're going to drop those full bios in the chat, but we are so excited to be joined by you today, Duci, and to hear from you about your advocacy. So again, in 60 seconds, Duci, why are you passionate about defending youth voices and supporting them and their responses in police encounters?
Thank you, Marianne. Really excited to be here today. For me, the question is, how can I not be passionate about young people's ability to be children and to react like kids when they encounter police? For me, it's really about changing the narrative and affirming our clients in their experiences with the police and really exposing the bias and injustice our clients suffer at the hands of police and in the juvenile legal system. And for me, it's also personal. As Chris said, for our young Black youth who are over policed, this is a big problem for them. And for me, as a mother of a young Black son, I want to be confident that my son will be safe when he's acting like a child and happens to encounter the police.
Thank you so much, Duci, for that description of why this matters so much to you in your work and all that you've done. We are also thrilled to be joined by Dr. Shameka Stanford. She has joined us previously, and we've learned so much from her. And as you all know, experts like Dr. Stanford make our advocacy so much better and so much stronger. We have so much to learn from you, Dr. Stanford, as a professor in the field of communication sciences and disorders, and the first and only juvenile forensic speech and language pathologist in the United States. Dr. Stanford's also a special education advocate, and she has worked on and specializes in juvenile forensic and law enforcement interactions with communication disorders and child language disorders. What's super exciting about having Dr. Stanford with us is that she does research on these issues. She sees for herself how the impact of policing impacts young people and how young people's expression, their communication ability, impacts their ability to engage in these encounters. Dr. Stanford, can you tell us in 60 seconds, why are you passionate about your work that supports youth's right to be children and react like children in police encounters?
It's a hard task for a speech and language pathologist, but I'm gonna try. Okay, so first and foremost, like everyone else on this panel, this is definitely personal for me because I have experienced it myself, and my little brother has been exposed to these unfortunate interactions. In addition to that, however, there is a pocket of the conversation around Black youth who are born with 3 strikes, and one of those strikes is having a cognitive or communication disorder that is rarely ever recognized or addressed. And so this is important to me because we need to start to have that discussion and conversation about the other things that impact youth outside of just mental health impairments or general development. So addressing and approaching this conversation from all avenues. Did I do it?
You did it.
All right.
That was awesome. Great job. Thanks to all of you for giving those introductions. I'm now going to turn the panel over to Professor Chris Henning, who's going to facilitate this conversation with you this afternoon. Thank you so much to all of you for being with us.
All right. Thank you again, Marianne, and to Duci and Dr. Stanford. We really appreciate you joining in this conversation. As Marianne said, our discussion today draws from chapter 7 of the Rage of Innocence. We're going to talk about the Contempt of Cop. So to set the stage for everyone, anybody who hasn't read the book, the term Contempt of Cop is a play on a criminal offense called contempt of court. A person can be charged with contempt of court when they blatantly fail to obey the orders of the court or are disrespectful to the court. Now, contempt of cop is not a real offense, as most of you know, right? But journalists and even some police officers have used the term to describe the situation in which someone is arrested, for example, for disrespecting the police, all right? So a classic scenario might look like this. A police officer stops a person, often a person of color, for some trivial reason or no reason at all. The person believes that the stop is racially motivated, and so they speak out. The officer feels disrespected and escalates the encounter with either some physical force or an arrest to reassert their authority in the situation. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about. And also to really bring this to life, because every conversation we have, as Shameka says, this, Dr. Stanford says, this is, about real kids, real people who are impacted, and it's real to all of us. So a perfectly disturbing example of this occurred several years ago in Portland, Oregon, and I write about this in chapter 7. So there is a 16-year-old Ty Gurule who is walking home one evening with his brother and a friend after a basketball game. Police officers are out that evening looking for a group of 7 to 9 Black men, including one man who apparently, or who reportedly didn't have a shirt on, and who was allegedly walking the streets, damaging property, and yelling profanities. Now, although Ty, his brother, and their friend did not match this description in any way other than race and gender, the officers approached them and ordered them to stop. When the boys did not stop right away, one of the officers yelled out to the boys, "Hey," and clapped his hands at the boys. Ty, being a 16-year-old, right, and being offended by the way in which they were being treated, turns around and yells at the officer, "Don't effing clap your hands at me," right? And of course, he filled in the blank. He didn't say effing. And the officers quickly wrestled him to the ground. They grabbed him by his hair. They pummeled him multiple times with their fists and their knees, and they tased him. Now, we are going to come back to this, to Ty's experience later in the webinar, but the reason that we wanted to start with this, and the reason we want to talk about this, is that Ty's case is one of the very few cases in which his judge, Judge Diana Stewart, when this case came to court, she's one of the few judges who clearly and immediately understood what had happened that night. And she publicly admonished the officers on the record for what she called a contempt of cop arrest. It's probably one of the only times I've ever seen this in like a legal, pleading or judicial pleading or judicial order. But she called it a contempt of cop arrest of a teenager who at worst had a bad attitude that night, right? The judge ruled that the police had no lawful reason to stop Ty. She acquitted him of all charges, and she described the officer's conduct as a senseless and aggressive use of force, right? Excessive force at that. So that's what we wanted to use to start the foundation. And so I'm going to turn to you, Duci. I certainly have seen these kinds of arrests in Washington, D.C., or these kinds of encounters in Washington, D.C. I have represented many clients who would not have been arrested, but for the fact that they talked back to a police officer and the officer got mad. So Duci, you are a defender in Massachusetts. And so let me ask you, have you seen this too? Can you give us some examples of behaviors for which young people have been arrested that really is just contempt of cop?
Chris, I'd love to say that here in Massachusetts, that just doesn't happen. But the reality is that's far from the truth. Unfortunately, we see kids being arrested for these kinds of things all the time, yelling at the police, swearing at the police. I can think of an example where a police officer was responding to a different call and some kids were walking by and the police had their window rolled down and someone said, "Fuck the police." And that officer got out and that quickly escalated to a really serious incident. So there are things that happen like that all the time where the police feel disrespected or that there's no respect for their authority, and that quickly can escalate to something. We've also had situations where police are stopping a group of kids and another group happens to think that encounter is not, happening in a way where the kids are safe. And they feel agitated and they're worried either about their friends or, just their neighbors. And they start yelling at the police about that police encounter. And we often have kids being charged with interfering with the police or escalating to some sort of public disturbance. Incidents where kids refuse to put their hands behind their back and hold their hands by their sides. Not stopping when the police ask them to stop and provide information, or not answering questions in a respectful or clear way. All those kinds of things are incidents that we see that lead to an escalation and thereafter charges.
There are far too many examples of this all across the country. And for those of you who haven't been on one of our webinars before, we like to be really engaged in the chat. And so I want to ask you, for those of you who are listening, who have heard about these, seen these in your local jurisdiction, seen them in your courthouses, put in the chat some examples, things that you've seen for which children have been arrested, or the encounter has escalated simply because the child was dissing the police or being non-responsive. And Dr. Of course, if you have an example, feel free to jump in. I certainly will be drawing you fully into the conversation momentarily. And okay, so look, so Duci, the other thing that you already started talking about was the types of offenses for which the actual charges that our children face in these kinds of contexts, right? So you talked about clients being arrested for resisting arrest as being one of the charges. Ty Gurule, in the scenario that I gave out of Portland, Oregon, was charged specifically with disorderly conduct, criminal threats, interfering with public safety or with a public officer, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault. All right. These are common, what folks call common cover charges in contempt of cop arrests. These cover charges are minor offenses that police officers use to ultimately justify their arrest for disrespecting the police, when in reality, there was no other underlying offense. And very often even the suspicion that led to the initial stop turned out to be completely unfounded. For example, there were no drugs, there was no weapon, there was nothing to justify that original stop in the first place. So what are some of the other cover charges that you have seen young people charged with? You already told us about resisting and interfering with an officer.
So in Massachusetts, similarly, disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, threat to commit a crime, inciting a riot, trespass, assault and battery on a police officer or a public official. Those are a lot of the common charges that we see around these types of cases.
So this is true all over the country, these sort of cover charges, if you will. And in fact, as you can imagine, right, it is very difficult to track this in some sort of empirical data-driven way. There's no national data on this. And police officers, of course, are not labeling their own arrest, right, as a contempt of cop arrest. But journalists have done some really good localized reporting on this. And not surprisingly, we see a lot of racial disparities. So for example, in Durham, North Carolina, some researchers analyzed all of the cases in which a person had been arrested for solely for resisting arrest, and which there was no other offense, all right, at all. And by doing that, looking at a resisting arrest and no other offenses being paired with it, gives a good indication that the initial basis for the stop was unfounded. And so when the researchers in Durham looked at the data, they discovered that only 23% of arrest for resisting arrest led to a conviction. All right. So again, you've got prosecutors or judges who did not think that the charges were warranted, that official formal charges were warranted after the person was brought in. And of course, in terms of racial disparities, 90% of those arrests involve people of color in Durham, North Carolina. I should note that similar studies have been done in Seattle, looking at obstructing a public officer, in Baltimore, looking at disorderly conduct, in Washington, D.C., looking at misdemeanor assault on a police officer. So I don't know, Duci, has there been any data collection that you're aware of in Boston on this?
There's some data collection on racial disparities in certain offenses like public offenses like disorderly conduct and misdemeanors. Massachusetts has the Juvenile Data and Policy Board that is really looking to track data, and I can put in the chat the website. They recently released an annual report as well as a data report that really looks at the disparities. Unfortunately, in Massachusetts, our racial and ethnic disparities are still really significant, and especially when it comes to these type of offenses. So there's charts within their report that really breaks down in terms of different offenses, not till the detail that we would need in this particular instance, but I think you can draw those parallels.
Right. And that's a lot of what this is drawing parallels, because we don't have, sort of raw data on, what constitutes a contempt of cop. That's good. And that's a takeaway. I mean, there'll be a lot of takeaways throughout this 2 hour that we need to figure out ways in our local jurisdictions to track this, right? So this is good. What I love about what appeared in the chat is that several of you, when I asked for examples of what you're seeing that constitutes, this sort of contempt of cop, is a number of you put in school-based examples, right? School discipline examples. And you're absolutely right that the parallel is there. Teachers calling the police or calling in a school resource officer when a child is quote unquote disrespectful or speaks out. This reminds me of in South Carolina when Nia Kinney filmed her classmate being arrested or being yanked out of her seat by the school resource officer, and Nia Kinney gets up and films, and she gets arrested for that. That's considered, contempt of cop. So we'll come back to that, but we really want to help the audience visualize what we're talking about. Those of us who are certainly from Washington, D.C., but this hit national news as well, but we will never forget the little girl who was arrested on the metro for violating the rules. And so what we're going to do is we're going to play you a little 3-minute clip from the metro station. And let me just say here that although the children that we serve do not get the grace of a trigger warning before their lives are about to be turned upside down, we do want to give you that grace of knowing that the videos that we are going to watch in this webinar are really quite painful to watch, and especially for Black parents. All right. So if we can play the first video, we will.
Not your world. All right, sit down. Sit down.
Oh my God.
Sit there.
I saw the God, bro. Oh, the shit out of me.
Sit down. Sit down. Do you know her mother's phone number? Nobody knows her information. Have a good day, folks. Now, where's your school ID?
I'm talking.
Okay. Put you down to If you want to ride the system, put your card through and go to the trains. If not, leave the station.
It was because she had a bag of chips in her wallet and a lollipop that she was eating because she was eating that.
Put it that tight. You're doing too much.
I'm really doing too much.
Fix it. Stop talking. Why you going through my stuff? Because I have food in my hand? The fuck? Doing too much. Son, I'm not like a fool for me.
How old are you?
No, I'm not telling you.
Okay.
Stop talking to me. You're not going to come. Can you come get my stuff?
Yes.
Can you go get my stuff?
Really? I thought you had none of that.
Oh, goodness. So she had a lollipop? That is outrageous, man. It's outrageous. Because she has a lollipop. That is ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. You could have told her to put it away. You could have told her to put it away, or took the lollipop. Or you could have took the lollipop. Why would you? That is crazy. That is so crazy.
Thank you for running Metros. You guys have a good
That is so crazy. Just a little girl. It's a little girl. It's a little girl. And you should just took the lollipop. That's all you should have done. Is took the lollipop from her, and that was it.
Well, we asked her for the lollipop.
And you have a good day. This is on camera for all these people. It doesn't matter. You can't shut my mouth.
That's why she's under arrest.
You can't shut my mouth. She has a lollipop. You should have took the lollipop.
I'm trying to explain to you
it's
what
a
happened.
little girl. It's a little girl.
Girls could break the law.
Okay, it's
like
fine.
everybody else.
But she's a minor.
And she goes to juvenile detention, and her
It's a
mom
minor.
comes and picks her up. That's
Okay,
how it works.
Fine, but you should have took the lollipop. That's ridiculous. And tighten up the handcuffs that time.
So indeed, very, very painful to watch, right? And there are so many pieces that we could pull and talk about in this video, but let me just share one thing that was the most sort of outrageous to me in this video, and that is the end. You notice when the officer says, he's speaking to the woman who is upset about the girl's arrest. And he says to her, well, you know what? She'll just go to juvenile detention and her mother will come pick her up. He says this like this is some temporary intrusion, right? With like minimal impact, psychological impact on this child without realizing the absolute gravity of this moment. And so let me turn to Duci and Dr. Stanford, and just to say, you know, again, we could talk about this for the whole 2 hours, but just one thing that was really disturbing to each of you about watching this video. Duci, I'll start with you.
For me, it's just the inhumanity. Like, you know, the way she's being treated, the way he kicked her like foot from underneath her and she falls to the ground, like just the way she's being treated while people are in, you know, telling people to just like, keep going, go about your business. Right. Nothing to see here, where like the way that she's treated to me is just the inhumanity.
Absolute inhumanity. And then the other thing you said, Duci, is this notion of like being so dismissive of all the onlookers. And think about how many of those onlookers are parents who are traumatized by seeing this. They see this as something that could happen to their child. Absolutely. Dr. Stanford.
I think it, for me, is the one condescending tone, but this underlying base to the condescending tone of this idea that I have to give you this information, like disregarding in a sense her rights and expecting that this is mandatory that you do this.
Right, right. Yep. You must obey me even if I'm right or wrong, which actually ties, meaning the officer is thinking this and perceiving this and engaging with this child in this way. And, you know, this ties back to a question that was posed in the chat by Samantha, which is, you know, for non-lawyers who are listening, there's a very good question. How could it be that someone could be arrested for resisting arrest when the arrest in and of itself was unlawful? The stop was unlawful. Well, unfortunately, our laws in many, if not most, if not all states, you know, say that you cannot resist an officer even for an unlawful arrest. The only time you can resist is if you think the officer is going to engage in excessive physical force. So you could act in self-defense of your, you know, your physical body, but just you cannot resist even when you are confident that the stop is unlawful. So yes, it is really odd and such an outer, you know, counterintuitive aspect of the law. Duci, did you want to add anything to that? Is that true in Massachusetts as well? Yeah. It's a really unfortunate reality of the law. Also, folks in the chat, did you all pick up on what's the rule? I see that we've got some DC folks. What's the rule that the little girl was violating? What was being violated in this video? What law did she break? Yes, eating food. That's it, right? No eating on the train. And as Tamara Gray notes, that she's from DC, and if we could count the number of riders on the train who have coffee cups, it's absurd that this child got arrested for that. But that really drives home what we are talking about today. And so, you know, it's worth noting, and Duci, you alluded to this as well, that a lot of these cover offenses are low-level misdemeanor offenses, like disorderly, like resisting arrest. But the other reality is that so many of these encounters escalate rapidly into much more serious offenses. So for example, when a child uses force because they are terrified, for example, that they will be hurt during a police encounter, in those cases, even if we later argue as defense counsel that they had a lawful basis to act in self-defense, you better believe children are getting arrested and charged with felonies, felony assault on a police officer, aggravated assault charges, because they are responding in what they perceive to be defense of themselves. So Duci, have you seen that as well, where an incident goes from 0 to 100 with a teenager, you know, in an instant?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, yes, you know, along with the charges that you mentioned, the assault and battery on a police officer, oftentimes we have assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. If somebody is, you know, flailing or kicking, then, you know, you have a shod foot, which is the dangerous weapon part. So yes, many times something very minor quickly escalates, and not only felony charges, but oftentimes the number of charges someone is charged with, you know, they will list every charge possible, really trumping up the charges. So yes, unfortunately, we do see that as well.
And when we see it, I mean, I assume this is true for you, Duci, like the media attention, it doesn't come in with that context, right? That background about how this started as some contempt of cop. It comes in as this aggressive, violent child, you know, assaulting police officers. And that's what we hear. And that's how this narrative gets perpetuated, this negative image of Black youth as being dangerous and aggressive, and especially towards police, gets perpetuated. So it's really disturbing. So I want to bring Dr. Stanford in this conversation. I mean, given what we know about adolescence and about the history of tension between Black and Latino youth and the police, it is no surprise that so many of these contempt of cop charges involve young people, teenagers, right? We know that adolescents, from previous webinars that we've had, you can find them all on the Gault Center's YouTube page, but we've talked about adolescents being impulsive, reactive, emotional, risk takers, fairness fanatics, I like to say, right? And they don't think ahead to the long-term consequences of their behavior. So any person, teacher, advocate, who spends time with a teenager knows that it's common for kids to talk back to authority figures. And so we have with us an expert, as Mary Ann introduced us to Dr. Stanford, who can help us think about how the child's developmental stage plays a significant role in how these encounters with police evolve. So Dr. Stanford, when we're talking about development, I'm thinking about biological development, socio-emotional development, executive functioning, and we know that that development is dynamic or changing across different circumstances. So for example, we know that young people often have the capacity to make a good decision when their emotions are cool and calm, but in emotionally charged situations, such as contact with the police, their cognitive and communication abilities are often literally overrun by their emotions. So can you help us understand this a bit more? Can you talk to us about the differences between chronological development, meaning just age, cognitive development, meaning the brain's development, and communicative development, and how that all of those spheres impact a young person's response to the police.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the first things that you kind of mentioned was the discussion around, when you think about development, you think about, the emotional part and those type of things. I think that that's kind of where, for most people, it starts, is that we tend to forget that even in an emotional process, something is being communicated. And so it is the necessary understanding that communication is a part of everything that you do in life. Where we have the disconnect is understanding how communication in language develops and presents itself. So there are three very, very different nuances, but in society, what happens is a lot of times youth are impacted by their interaction with law enforcement based only on their chronological age, or based solely on the presentation of emotions, which is the primary behavior that law enforcement is trained to recognize. They're behaviorally trained. I respond, I react to behaviors. I don't react to I don't respond to eliminating the process of affecting a behavior. So a chronological age is just your birth date. You can have a chronological age of 17, for instance, but have been born premature, which means cognitively, your brain development may still be at a 15-year-old age. And so there's a disconnect of 2 years there where I'm looking at you as a 17-year-old. However, the way you communicate may be at the level of a 15-year-old because of where your brain is, based on where you were born or what has impacted it. Communication-wise, communication is impacted by so many different things. It's impacted by your culture, impacted by your educational process. And so we know, and I know personally, that a lot of times the education that we receive for the youth that are most impacted by law enforcement is less than. It is a very under-resourced process, for a nicer word. And so what we ultimately have to recognize is that when we're expecting youth, for instance, to be 17 chronologically and cognitively have a 17-year-old ability, that means that you're expecting that they have been exposed to all of the things that, for instance, the mainstream white population has said a youth needs to be successful in society and academics, which is not always the case. And so you may communication-wise have a youth that is not only responding by the default culture, where in my culture, it may be common for what I have seen, for instance, when I am angry at Duci, my response is to curse, because that's my model in my community, and what I see. I have not been exposed to or taught to say, you know what, Duci, I'm upset right now. Can we get 2 minutes to talk about this? So the expectation that every youth is going to communicate the same, that every youth brain develops the same, and that every youth, because they are the same age, will respond the same, is where we have this large disconnect and problem, because police don't always understand that, society doesn't understand that. And so we respond to those different things, where what we really need to be focused on is the cognitive age and the communicative age. Where is a child cognitively, regardless of age, and where is their communication ability? It is unjust and unfair to say you should have known better when I can't know what I don't know. And I can't know, you don't know what I know. So to expect me to respond the way you have responded is a disconnect in understanding where my communication ability has been.
Oh, I so love that, Dr. Stanford. I think it's just there were so many pieces of that, I think, that are useful for us as youth advocates. I mean, first of all, this notion that we need to pay most attention to cognitive development and communicative development in assessing, a child's engagement. We're expecting more from that child than is warranted, right? Given one, you talked about cultural, your cultural upbringing, the quality of education, public education in your school is really important. And just the basics of adolescent development, right? Adolescents, by developmental stage, regardless of class and race, often are not equipped. As you say, I often phrase it this way, a teenager isn't going to walk up to an officer and say, Mr. Officer, I don't like the way you're treating me today. And I don't like the way you've treated Black Americans and Latino Americans. They don't say that. That's not what they do. So I think that's very, very helpful. I also thought and this is important for us as advocates, and how do we educate judges and other stakeholders and school systems about this really important body of research that you're talking about. And I also was moved by your initial statements that police officers are trained to look behaviorally or to respond to adolescent behaviors that are driven by emotion instead of cognitive and communicative, instead of recognizing that. So that was very, very helpful for me. Sorry, I got excited. And I felt like I just repeated what you said, not quite as well as you did, but I just was very moved by that as an advocate. So the other thing that I want us to talk about, and I think that you can really help us about, is that these heated moments with law enforcement are difficult for everyone, and even more difficult for adolescents in general, and then even more challenging for youth of color, Black and Latino youth, who are so frequently targeted. And then now let's add one more layer to that. They're even more difficult to navigate for youth with disabilities, right? And that's one of your areas of expertise. And what folks on the Zoom don't know is that the first time I ever met Dr. Stanford, we went out to lunch, and I wanted to tell her about a client that I was representing. And I told Dr. Stanford about my client named Kwame. Kwame was a 17-year-old child I was representing at the time, who was charged with assault on a police officer, unlawful entry, and multiple counts of destruction of property. Kwame was arrested when he entered a metro station, much like the girl that we saw. He entered a metro station after having been barred from returning to that station earlier that morning because he was caught that morning jumping the turnstile or entering without paying. As soon as the officer approached him in the afternoon, Kwame knew that he had been caught, and he immediately put his hands behind his back as if he were in faux cuffs, right? And then in the first few minutes, Kwame engaged very, very calmly with one of the officers who was standing off to his side, speaking to him with very little emotion, and that it appeared, to be quite frank, that everything was going to be okay until moments later, when another officer walked up, put his arms on Kwame's shoulder, and began pulling Kwame to the door. At that moment, Kwame lost all control. He began screaming and kicking and flailing his arms, and he was even banging his head on the turnstile as multiple officers joined in. When the officers finally handcuffed him, dragged him outside, Kwame kicked a metal newspaper stand and was forced into a police car, where he then began kicking at the door violently, knocking it off of its hinges. And Kwame's story is remarkable, both for how quickly this incident escalated and for how little training these officers had to deal with this child. Really, if the officers had just continued to talk to Kwame quietly or calmly without touching him, it is very unlikely that this incident would have exploded the way it did. And one of the officers even told Kwame's guardian that it appeared right away that something was off about Kwame. Yet the officers did what they always do. They got in his face, they escalated instead of de-escalating the situation, and then they arrested him. And so indeed, it turns out Kwame had, and you helped me go back and ask the right questions. It turned out that Kwame was on 8 different medications for ADHD, mood disorder, anxiety, and sleep disruption. And he was scheduled to be tested for autism in the following weeks. So, let's talk about this example. I mean, you helped me understand it. So, and can you help the rest of us really understand the type of difficulties that a client or a young person like Kwame would have in navigating an encounter with the police like this?
Absolutely. So I think that, one of the key things that you said that I kind of want to focus on is the fact that Kwame knew he had been caught and he put his hands behind his back, and where most of the time that's the argument, right? Like, well, if he didn't know he was doing wrong, how come when he saw us, he did blank, blank, blank. However, when we're talking about language learning disabilities and communication disorders, one of the things to recognize is I may have responded just because I know cops equals, especially as a Black man, cops or Black young man, teenager, cops equals problem, or cops equals get down and don't resist. And so Kwame may not have actually been responding to the fact that, dang it, they told me don't come in the train station. Just the fact that I saw a cop, and the last time I saw a cop, this is what happened. So whenever I see a cop, I'm going to do this. The disconnect is the fact that what I processed from the situation was that Kwame's being trespassed from the location may have been literal. I was not allowed to go in that specific train station. And so, okay, you said don't come in this one, but that don't mean I can't go in this one and jump the turnstile. This is a whole different one. So there may have been two different things happening here where I was responding to the cops being present, but I wasn't responding to the I knew that I shouldn't have been doing it type of thing because of my language and learning disabilities. The other thing is the impulsivity that comes with ADHD. And a lot of times, again, when we're talking about brain development, that area of the brain that thinks rationally, even when you're at a certain age, when there's things that are present that are disorders and breakdowns, may impact that. And so there may have been a level where even if I did know, okay, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, the ability to provide an alternate situation is so impaired that the impulsivity overrides it, because I know I shouldn't do it, but what's the option? I don't have an option, so forget it, I'm gonna just do it. And so there's so many other factors to what may have impacted why he continued to move forward with what he did, and then how the officers responded to him. We talk about those different factors of, not understanding sensory processing disorders. And so one of the things that I always talk about is the fact that communication disorders and a lot of times mental health impairments do not have a, and so you can't look at somebody and see, oh, there's going to be something wrong here. And so, but not understanding that touching someone, especially when they're not prepared for it, or not recognizing how the level of touch may impact them. Kwame may have had some sensory impairments. And so when you touch them, you've triggered all of the sensory impact. A lot of times I talk to officers about the temperature of their handcuffs. One, it's metal, it is cold. But if you're talking about someone that has autism, for instance, with a sensory impairment, that cold is 100 times more cold. It is like needle prickles on my hand. So the reaction that you're going to get is not just ow, it's hot. You're going to get that ultimate lash out, that ultimate kicking and screaming that now you're trying to say it's assault and battery and resisting arrest. But really, you triggered me when you didn't recognize my disorder and you did something that resulted in that level of response, that extra piece. And then putting him in a car, you've now actually isolated him and closed him off into a confined space. If I'm having sensory impairments in a cop car where lights are flashing, in a space where your speaker is going off, you're giving me all of this stimuli in addition to me trying to process what's going on. That's when you only get the emotional part, because I can't clear everything else out to functionally respond or communicate to you.
Wow, this is powerful, which is exactly why we need experts like you in our cases, and why, truly the conversation that we had around this was just game-changing for me in understanding not just Kwame, but so many of my other clients. One of the other things that I recall you're teaching me that I've also never forgotten was that children with communicative and cognitive disorders often have difficulty understanding and processing WH words, right? WH questions like who, what, where, when. And can you say more about that, Dr. Stanford?
Yeah, so ultimately us as the neurotypical individual, quote unquote, we don't automatically think about the levels and processes it takes to answer questions like what, why, who, when, where, and how. However, the development and understanding of those questions happens on a hierarchy. And so we have to keep in mind that what is a very concrete question. Usually if I'm asking you a what, it's because it is right in front of us. What is that? What are you doing? However, the why are you in the train station, or why are you not in school right now, is abstract, number one. The response may not be the one you want. It doesn't make the response wrong. It's just based on how I perceived the situation or the conversation. Or it may be that because it's not concrete, I can't give you an answer. Sometimes youth have not had the ability to learn WH questions. So when you ask a why question, I might answer with a what. Why are you not in school? This is my book bag, because I don't know how to answer that question because I don't understand the abstract parts of it. And so what happens is officers get frustrated because they think you're not answering their questions, that contempt of cop, right? You're disregarding my question, you're being disrespectful, or you're trying to be funny in front of the crowd, when really there actually is a breakdown where I can't answer those type of questions because they are above my current ability.
Again, extremely, extremely helpful. I'm like glancing through my notes from our initial interview. One of the things that also, and yet another thing beyond the who, what, where, when, was that children like Kwame also have difficulty following multiple instructions, particularly rapid fire, multi-step instructions, like those that are given by police officers. Stand up, take your hands out of your pocket, step back, put your hands up where I can see them, be quiet. And instead they need directions simplified or repeated. And indeed, when I went back and I shared that, or talked to my client's guardian, Kwame's guardian, she explained, she was like, oh yeah, I have to guide him in the morning with every individual instructions. Okay, one by one. Now, take your toothbrush out. Now, brush your teeth. Now, wash your face. Now, put on your shirt. Now, and so it was fascinating the ways in which that mapped on to what you had taught me. So is there more to say with regard to that?
Definitely following directions is another one, because you have different types of directions. Following a verbal direction is different from following a visual direction. Most of the time with youth engaging with officers, you're trying to follow a direction with distractors present. So you want me to attend to you, and I have people on their phones, I have the trains going by, I have, like we saw in the video, individuals yelling about what's happening, and you're telling me 5 and 6 things at a time. Most times what you'll see is the individual is either going to do the last or the first thing they heard. Everything in between got lost. But again, there's that upset where officers feel like you're just disregarding me. And we've seen this in cases where the officer was yelling to the individual, put your hands behind your back. The other officer was telling that same person to sit down. And I want to say they deployed their taser and tased the individual. And it was more so the issue that both of you all are giving directions to a person at the same time, where if a child has a learning disability or difficulty attending to task, giving me more than one thing to do at a time is going to be a problem. If I did that to you all right now, most of everybody is going to fail following verbal directions. We can't do it, but we automatically take it for granted that at some level we can follow directions. So we forget that at some point, a child, just a typically developing child, but a child with a disability is going to have difficulties recalling, 1, remembering what you said, but 2, processing those directions in the situation, and especially when it's heightened.
Yes, very, very helpful, very helpful. So I love this. Stacy says, in court, we can object to compound questions and confusing questions, but we can't do that on the street. And our kids don't have the capacity to do that in the moment. But that's such a good point. I just can't emphasize how helpful the information that you're sharing is, Dr. Stanford, especially for those of us actively representing children, for example, in legal cases, right? And so, I could use what you taught me maybe to defend against one of the charges, resisting arrest or disorderly or assault on a police officer. So that's Kwame's case is just one example. There are other examples. We found, as we were preparing for this workshop, a 2017 Washington State appellate court, a Washington State appellate case, State versus DED, in which the court overturned an adjudication involving a Black child charged with obstructing justice. In that case, the child stiffened up and pulled away when officers attempted to handcuff him. And he cursed at the officers at the beginning of the interaction. There's really powerful language in the concurrence to that opinion. We're going to put this in the chat, and it's available on our racial justice toolkit for defenders, but there's really powerful language in the concurrence, noting that the officer's actions in this case was reminiscent of slavery and that no one should be surprised or offended by a person having this type of response to a law enforcement unconsented and unlawful intrusion. And so just such a powerful way to help us litigate. And in that case, I don't even think the child was disabled or had it identified, I should say, had an identified disability in that case. So one other thing that we wanted to ask you about, Dr. Stanford, is that, or one of the things I should say that we could be litigating as advocates in these cases is the Fourth Amendment or Fifth Amendment rights. Fourth Amendment being search and seizure rights, or the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure for those of you who aren't lawyers on the phone, and the Fifth Amendment rights, which is the right to avoid self-incrimination. And so, Dr. Stanford, you said that youth with speech and language disorders often have difficulty following instructions. And I imagine that they also have difficulty asserting their rights, saying, I assert my right not to answer your questions. Can you say a little bit about that? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I absolutely would. It is a fair assessment. And most of the time, what I recommend is, I think that a lot of times what happens is the complexity of the statement. And so just being very concrete and simple and saying, don't say anything, for instance, is that understanding of what falls in that category of my rights. Because like we said, you have a lot of other things that may influence that interaction of, even though you've told me not to, or you've explained to me my rights, if there are impairments, a lot of times, and cognitive impairments, officers, we don't always want to, make it like, but officers have a way of being able to make it seem as though if you tell me, then I'll let you go. Or if you hurry up and do such and such, then we can get past this. And so because problem solving also is an area of difficulty sometimes for youth that have cognitive and communication disorders, if you say to me, okay, if I just tell you what I did, you're going to let me go home. The consequential thinking part of saying there's no plausible way that if I tell you, yes, I took such and such or did such and such, even if I didn't do it, I'm going, is where the youth has difficulty understanding it. They will still decide to override their rights and say things. I've seen, for instance, officers make the statement to a youth, I'm kind of like a psychologist. So you can tell me, what it is that you want to talk to a psychologist or a lawyer about, and then I can get you the best one. And then youth will tell things that they shouldn't tell because they don't have that full consequential and problem solving understanding of what it means. So it's best recommended to just be very concrete across the board, even when the youth doesn't have a documentability, to just say, it's best to not say anything. So like in the clip you showed, the young lady would not give her name, and it's easier for you all as the attorneys to argue that on the other side than it is to try to backtrack you giving a confession or response voluntarily, and so me not giving my name, but like you said, you can argue if she didn't give my name, but there's no crime against that, versus you telling me anything else that happened in that situation. So I think that it is, hard for you to understand the additional consequential processes that with being very forthcoming, even when they think that they're helping. And so being very concrete in those discussions around recognizing what your right is from a very basic level is how we should move forward.
Yes, very, very helpful. Again, helping us understand and maybe incorporate these arguments into our written pleadings, into our oral advocacy at that pretrial suppression stage with statements, when we're trying to suppress a statement. So this is very, very helpful. There's a question in the chat that we want to see if you can help us answer, Dr. Stanford. This is a question from Stacy, and she's trying to figure out, and I think this is a great question, whether or not there are resources, right? pre-existing maybe communication cards. Like, I don't know, I know I have seen people who have hearing impairments walk around with cards, and they hand a card and says, I can't hear. You see that sometimes in the airport. Are there maybe like, is there something like that a child, could have, could give? Are there ways to be preemptive about this?
So that's a good question. And I have two responses to that. So one, there is not one, and I don't recommend it or encourage clinicians to create one. One, because there isn't one static understanding. And so what happens is, even with those autism or neurodivergent cards, what it does is it tells the individual the person is going to respond this way. So what happens when they don't respond that way? You're expecting a certain response, and then that can still cause a de-escalated situation because you're looking at it one way. These things are spectrums. And so you can have a youth that is high level that does not do all of the things on this directive, but the officer has approached the situation expecting it to be this way. Or the individual is nonverbal and they are self-injurious. So they start biting and kicking and screaming, and you don't know how to respond because you've been trained to this card that we as specialists gave out. The same thing happens with communication disorders. There isn't one set way. They don't all manifest or look the same in individuals. And so I don't encourage that, because people marry the content. And if it doesn't look this way, then you have the argument that happens in court that says, well, the clinician told me this, and that wasn't what the case was, and that's why I responded this way. Make it a little easier to make an excuse for it. The second reason is because if we're keeping it 100, as Black individuals, I don't recommend anybody give a Black child a card where they got to reach in their pocket for anything. And I'm not okay with them reaching. And so a lot of times clinicians, and we are a profession that is 96% white, their recommendation is a card. But as a Black person, me expecting a Black boy to say, hold on, let me give you something, and then you reach, and this situation is already where it is, I've put you in a place of heightened danger, and I'm not for that. And so I don't recommend cards or anything where they got to go in their pocket to get anything.
Wow. So I got to say, that was such an incredibly thoughtful answer, because our gut instinct, I got that. I understood where the question was coming from. And Stacy, she responded, I get it. I understand. Like, I would have thought that, like, we want to be preemptive. We want to protect our child, but you make some really, really good points about that. I also had to just shout out Maggie, who says the card should read, I'm a teenager, dummy. That's what the card should read. That's a great response. But I really appreciate, in all seriousness, your answers. And I have to say, your answer reminded me of Stefan Watts, right? You and I have talked about, and I think you've written about Stefan Watts. This is the young man who was autistic in, I want to say it was in Illinois.
Yes.
Can you give us the 2-minute version of that story?
So there's so many stories like his. I think Stefan Watts, you have Matthew Russian, you have, and so all of these stories are, instances where the officer responded based on getting interaction with the individual that was alternative from what they knew. And I feel like in that they interviewed that officer, and his response was, I'm not a mental health professional, so I should not have known. But I mean, slammed to the ground, knee on neck, handcuffed. And it took, someone running out of a building to say, I'm with him, he has autism, because one, he wasn't answering the questions correctly. So the officer asked what his name was, and he gave another response. And I feel like the officer's reason was he looked like he was selling drugs in the area because he was walking around stimming, rubbing his hand together. So, you have these situations where those things don't always benefit us to do for the youth.
Absolutely. And building on that one, that's like Rashawn's story. I think Stefan's story, he got shot and killed in his own house that's okay. No, both stories were perfectly appropriate. Like he got shot and killed because his father had been trained, his father and mother had been trained to call the police to get him to calm down. What was so powerful about that story is the police department was on absolute notice. In there, whenever there's a 911 call from Stefan Watts's address, the police department was alerted that an autistic child lived in the house. And the officers had been trained on how to deal with autistic children, had been brought out to the house. And then still on the day of the incident, they shot and killed him. They said that he came out with a knife, and all they needed to do was verbally de-escalate him. And they did not do that. despite the fact that at least some officers in that department had been trained. So all of that to say, the training even wasn't enough under these high emotional circumstances for the officers. So let me just, quickly bring in oh yeah, go ahead.
Really quickly to the comment, Kristin Palmore. So keep in mind that crisis intervention training trains us for mental health impairments. It doesn't train for cognitive and communication disorders. So officers still won't know about what we're talking about because it only looks at things like schizophrenia and any of those mental breakdowns that happen in individuals.
This is a fabulous question, both by Kristin and your response remind me of just how much police are involved in circumstances that they don't need to be involved in. So I always talk about, we need to radically reduce the footprint of police in the lives of Black and brown children by how about when you get a 911 call, the 911 operator needs to be trained to redirect that call to a crisis intervention or a cognitive impaired, a cognitive specialist or something. We've got to have a better triage decision. We rely on police for absolutely everything. So Duci, let me just bring you in and just to ask, I imagine that this conversation between myself and Shameka and the audience has really been resonating with you. I've seen you nod a few times. Does this sound like what you've seen? Have you represented young people with disabilities who have had these experiences?
Absolutely. Not only in street encounters, but we often get quite a few cases from schools and children dealing with school resource officers and kids who are in particular classrooms for a cognitive disability or a learning disability, and still having a school resource officer within that setting, still not knowing how to appropriately interact with a child with disabilities. And we have so many kids that are funneled from the school into our juvenile legal system for these issues that Dr. Stanford addressed. So it's not only in the street encounters, but also the encounters that happen at school.
Yeah, such an incredibly important point. And especially since it's the school environment where everyone there should be trained. Well, I don't want to say everyone, but certainly there should be specialists on site who are trained to work with young people with cognitive and communicative, disorders or mental health disorders, all of this, right? So really, really just disturbing, for lack of better words. All right, so we've been talking about police youth encounters involving youth with disabilities. And we know the challenges that all of these challenges that we've been talking about impact youth of all races who have disabilities. But the challenges we've been talking about are exacerbated when Black and Latino and Indigenous youth are involved due to racial biases, right? So for example, we know the research on implicit racial bias shows that both police and civilians are more likely to believe or perceive Black boys as significantly older than they actually are. We know research shows that adults are more likely to perceive Black girls as older, more mature, less innocent, less in need of protection. Research shows that individuals are more likely to perceive ambiguous or innocuous facial expressions on Black youth as threatening and aggressive, and that they are more likely to perceive Black males, for example, as stronger, heavier, taller, more muscular than white males of the exact same height, build, and weight. And so we have shared our annotated bibliography on implicit racial bias in the juvenile and criminal legal system on almost every webinar, because it is just that important. It is just that important and so intricately tied to each and every one of these conversations. So we want to talk about that. We want to talk about the racial disparities and the way race exacerbates what we've been talking about. So again, we want to show another video. And again, I want to give you the grace of a trigger warning, letting you know that this video is very painful to watch. And so we will play now the video of Tremaine McMillan, who was 14 years old and who was stopped by the police. And so we'll play that now.
I ran over there and said, that's my son, could you get off him like that? He can't breathe.
This video captures a Miami-Dade police officer with his arm around the neck of 14-year-old Tremaine McMillan.
I was at the beach playing with my friends. That's when the police had what's the name, told us to stop. So I had asked why. And I said, he told me because he said so.
His body language of stiffening up, closing the fist, flaring his hands, trying to pull away. Well, now you're resisting an officer at that point.
Police say McMillan refused their repeated requests to take them to his parents, giving them dehumanizing stares.
It's pretty outrageous. I don't know what a dehumanizing stare is, but even if there is such a thing, it shouldn't provoke this kind of police conduct.
I think that the way that they treated a child is disgusting. That sort of action should not happen or be tolerated here.
We're going to criminalize this child by assigning him the ability to be dehumanizing by the way he looks at people. We're going to characterize his body language and his position as something that is menacing.
In an attempt to make it sound like it is more aggressive conduct to justify what the police then do.
My son was walking and they jumped off their ATVs, grabbed him and slammed him to the ground.
He started choking me. As he was choking me, I urinated on myself because I couldn't breathe.
Your brother do anything to make him do this at all?
No, I just saw him walking.
All of that body language alone is already letting the officers know that this is a person that's getting agitated and can become violent. What we're concerned about is the immediate threat towards the officer.
I just think it undermines your faith in the system in general. We need to be very careful about ensuring that if the police need to use force, that they only do it in circumstances where it's absolutely necessary and appropriate.
I think everybody looking at this video should think about this child as their child. This little boy is a boy in their neighborhood, their community.
Is body language resistance? Is fear of our own police worthy of violence? What's dehumanizing is how he was treated. What's dehumanizing is being beaten for standing still. My son, your son, our son. Does it really matter whose son? Sign the petition. Dropthecase.com.
Wow, wow, wow. That's really almost all that can be said to that. But again, you know, we could spend 2 hours unpacking that. But let me just pull some threads, right? Dr. Stanford, in your work, you discuss how adults, teachers, police officers, others, neighbors, view these behaviors differently for Black youth compared to white youth. Can you say, one, you know, what really stood out to you, you know, any one thing that really stood out to you? How would you process this this incident, this encounter with Tremaine McMillan, and, you know, help us understand what's happening? I should just note for the audience that after that video was prepared, Tremaine's case was dismissed, but only due to what, you know, public outcry. And the officers still were angry about Monday morning quarterbacking. But I wanted the audience to know that. But can you help us, Dr. Stanford, understand this?
So I think what stood out to me and in line with your question is, I want to say the audacity, but ultimately this expectation that the youth did something to the officer, the adult. And I think that stands out because that happens all the time where, you know, officers will say to me, well, when are you going to teach the kids how to talk to us? And it's this idea of when you put down your title as an adult and a grown, because of this expectation or this feeling that you have of how Black youth and Latinx youth should defer to you or kowtow to you in any situation. And that's a lot of, what I saw in this conversation, and even you saying after the fact they were upset, is the audacity of you to allow this kid to engage with me this way.
Just, kids being kids, roughhousing on the beach, right? On, like, it's just, it is just absolutely audacious, playing, doing what kids do, not allowed to be kids. And then an officer intervenes. And of course, the kid is like, why am I following you, right? And then the language dehumanization. That, just for folks to know, I know in the chat, we put in the chat the study by Dr. Philippa Atiba Goff, where both police officers and civilians perceive Black youth, Black boys in particular, to be more than 4.5 years older than they actually are. The reason why I wanted to come back to that study is because Dr. Goff and his colleagues are also studying dehumanization. They're studying the ways in which Black children are perceived subconsciously in the mind as apes, right? Not human. And that's exactly how the audacity of someone to not speak. It's not even the audacity of someone, you are less than human. How dare you not bow down and curtail to me? And the perception of that adolescent play was perceived as worthy of intervention in the first place. So much to unpack. Duci, what was your thought and reaction to this?
Similarly to Dr. Stanford and you, for me, it's the criminalization of adolescence and also his Blackness, because immediately the narrative is changed, right? To make him be, the bad person, the stare, his body immediately tensed up, the officer described, and now I knew he was resisting. This is even before the police have that encounter, right? They make all of these descriptions just based on his appearance, and his appearance is a young Black boy. So with that, you have the criminalization of his Blackness and the adolescence. That's, really what stood out to me, that immediately that officer felt him, a child, to be a threat.
Absolutely, right? He goes on, right? He's like, what does he say? He was like, their body language, his body language immediately let me know. And that really goes back to the point that Dr. Stanford made earlier, that they're trained to look for those, the behavioral, to respond to those behaviors and to respond to emotion of the young people, instead of, engaging him. First of all, I don't even know why he's engaging him. So I walked that back. I was going to say, why not just engage him in a conversation? There was no conversation to be had. For those of you who don't know how the story started, like I said, he was roughhousing, and then the officer said, "Where is your mother? Take me, point me, and take me to your mother." And he's like, "I'm sorry, why?" So there shouldn't have been any intervention in the first place. It's the criminalization, as you say, Duci, so incredibly much that we could talk about. And it for me, reflects the incredible racial bias in those perceptions of ambiguous or innocuous behaviors. Why in God's green earth are you using the word dehumanizing stares, clenched fists, flailing hands? Like, that language just sounds so, animalistic. So there's a lot there. All right. And the other piece to note that really stood out is, again, this is a child charged initially with resisting arrest for stiffening up and pulling away, just like the Washington State example, just like my client, sort of Kwame, all of these examples. Why is this not understood as a fight, flight, or freeze response, right? Sort of that basic understanding. And so, we could talk about that more when we, talk about some of the solutions. But let's talk about, one other thing that I really want us to get to, which is this notion of sort of the battle of the egos, right? So racial bias explains a good portion of why Black and Latino youth are treated differently than white youth in these encounters. But another piece of this is the culture of policing today. right? And how officers are explicitly and implicitly trained to respond to civilians, either by watching their supervisors or internalizing messages from the lack of discipline that other officers received after an act of violence towards a civilian. And there's a really great article. There are many great articles by Dr. Philip Atiba Goff. Y'all should just put him on Google Alert in your calendar. I think I've said that before, but there's a really good article by Marie Pryor, Kim Buchanan, and Dr. Philip Atiba Goff called Risky Situations, Sources of Racial Disparity in Police Behavior. And we'll drop that in the chat. But the article identifies 5 factors that contribute to racially disparate behaviors by the police. One is the broad discretion that police officers are given with little or no guidance on how to intervene in certain circumstances, or even whether to intervene for that matter. There's also the inexperience of the officer. There is the pervasive association between crime and Blackness in our society that has an impact on officers. There's also cognitive overload, or the fact that when an officer walks up on a scene, particularly a very fast acting scene, or what they perceive to be fast moving scene, their brain is in overload, thinking about all the things that are happening around them. And then the 5th factor is identity threat. And that's what I want to talk about for a second. I want us to focus on. And the authors of this study talk about, when they're talking about identity threat, one of them is masculinity, or masculinity norms, and the fear of being judged as unmanly. So officers may respond to perceived masculinity threat by, for example, an adolescent male suspect, by doubling down on their commitment to masculinity. For example, acting in violence, demonstrating their physical strength. And this is really what's fascinating. In the study, the authors talk about how officers who are assigned to traditionally less confrontational roles, such as school resource officers, community-oriented policing, or youth education programs, may overcompensate when they fear that their work has been devalued or feminized, in contrast to more stereotypical masculine assignments, such as beat patrol, homicide investigation, gang task force, SWAT teams, vice squads, things like that, right? And so this is a part of that masculinity threat. For those of you who are interested, not only in Marie Pryor and Dr. Goff's article, but Professor Frank Rudy Cooper writes extensively about masculinity and policing, and especially how police create masculinity contests with civilians. So we're going to put some of those in the chat for you so that you can read them. But let me turn back to Dr. Stanford. And I also should say, as we always do at the end of the webinar, or in the week after the webinar, we will send you all an annotated bibliography with all of these resources if you can't draw them all down today. But I wanted to go to Dr. Stanford. I've heard you talk about, I think you even said this to me the first time we ever met, about youth police encounters being a battle of the egos. Right? Was a phrase that you used. And so can you tell us what you mean by that and what that's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a few things happening. Masculinity threat is a big thing. What happens where there's a clash is that you're dealing also with the social development of youth, and especially, Black and Latinx youth, where my reputation means a lot in this sector, and especially when we're thinking about junior high and high school. Your reputation is make or break in those years. If one little thing can throw off the whole process, and then the rest of high school or junior high school is a bust for you. And so when you are where it feels like they are stunning you or disrespecting you, or treating you like a simp, there's going to be those interactions where I have to prove myself. I have to gain my respect. I can't let my friends or my homeboys or the girl I'm trying to get the phone number from see me being embarrassed like this in this setting. And so a lot of times you're having this pushback where it's like, the fact that you're embarrassing me in public, I got to respond to it. And then the officer's response is, as not only a man, but as a white man, you should know your place in this process because this is not how you talk to me. And then also, again, going back to that culture, you have that cultural process of, if this is not how you're used to kids talking to you, you're going to have a problem with that. But, every family doesn't say that this is how you have to engage with adults. What's interesting is that I'm actually writing an article on this masculinity threat, but really what we have to talk about is the masculinity threat that happens with Black girls and Black women. We're seeing this increase, right, of officers being very aggressive and disrespectful to Black girls and Black women. And what's happening is Black women speak up. And so you are questioning my mask. And a lot of times other races feel like when Black women speak up that we are demasculating men or, emasculating men and treating men. And so there is this argument and this clash that's happening not only with Black boys, but Black girls, where I'm saying, well, why do I need to throw away my lollipop where you feel emasculated? And so now you have to prove something, and your proving is in your physical response. And so those, a lot of times what is happening is that social makeup and development of youth, but also just the culture of Black women. We've always been at the forefront. We've always been the ones to speak up. So the process of us speaking up in this current environment bothers some that are trying to stabilize their own masculinity. And we're seeing this in the polices of Black girls.
Again, wow, like just such great insights. I can't wait to read your article. You are, this stuff is so incredibly enlightening. Really so right. This notion how a masculinity threat, an officer feels that masculinity threat when a young Black girl, comes for them, if you will. Really powerful stuff. I also realize as I listen to you that I am clearly getting old, because I would have talked about the kids punking, the officers feeling like they've been punked. And apparently there are new words, sunning you and sip. So I'm going to have to add that to my vocabulary.
That's because I'm still in therapy. I'm still in the clinical realm. They keep me young.
Yeah, I have clients too. I need to I need to be listening carefully and asking the right questions. I love it. I love it. But thank you for all of this. Again, I really look forward to reading your article. And as Eliza asked the question, yes, we will be sending an email with all of the links, all of the resources that we talk about. We try to summarize those for you in plain language and give you the citations so that you can use them. Very helpful stuff. All right, so Duci, let me turn back to you. And if we think about these videos, Dr. Stanford just talked about the Black girl at the Metro. We've looked at the video with Tremaine McMillan, and we see that police are often aggressive and even violent with Black, Latinx, and other youth of color, particularly when they perceive youth as disrespectful and oppositional. So we've talked a bit about use of force, but at the same time, I want to pick up on a thread that Dr. Stanford, raised here, which is that these perceived acts of defiance by Black and Latinx youth are often instances of civil disobedience and a rejection of racist policing policies, right? So, Shameka talks about a Black woman's going to speak out, right? She's going to, say, this isn't right. And so we see that with Black youth come from a long tradition of speaking out against injustice, and their talking back to an officer is often a form of protest. So can you say a bit more about what that has looked like in your practice, what you've seen in your practice, and give us a little bit more context around this notion that maybe what's coming into court is an adolescent protest?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things is first really understanding the history between the tension between Black youth and police, and how that has really shaped the way that Black youth respond to interactions with the police. And as you were mentioning, Chris, there's this history of civil disobedience to resist racism and disparate treatment by the police. And I think today, where everything's really in your face, we have youth who are seeing, on video police mistreatment, killing of Black and brown people. And so, that reaction is a form of protest, and it's being interpreted by the police as criminal acts, and youth are being hauled into court for what is really protest against the treatment, over policing of Black youth, the inequities that they face in their communities, their personal experience, their family history. And as I said before, now everything is so accessible. You have really 24-hour coverage when you take into account social media, media coverage, and then that trauma of seeing this day in and day out. And then when you have that encounter with the police, expressing frustration, anger over this continued abuse, it plays out in that manner. That's how I've really seen it out, by youth being vocal against this treatment, and then that being turned, as we were talking about before, being criminalized and then being brought into court for these actions.
Yeah, so they're brought into court for, an arrest, and often for those cover charges that we've been talking about throughout the whole hour and a half. But then on this use of force point, they're also physically, assaulted, or, manhandled, if you will, or woman handled, if you will. And have you seen that, like the sort of the immediate physical reaction?
Absolutely. It, compounds the situation, because you have, kids who are being vocal, expressing themselves against, what they see as an injustice, and then immediately, physically confronted by the police. So then you have that added layer of that physical trauma that they're experiencing during these interactions. And in many cases, as we sort of started out talking, you have these minor incidents that quickly escalate and a lot of times become physical. And you have incidents like, unfortunately, the video that we just saw with someone being, in a chokehold, their knee, an officer's knee against their back, their face being smashed into the pavement. All of these really physical, damaging things being done to our youth, and that, then really has a lasting impact on future interactions with the police.
That's absolutely right, Duci, right? As the research, tells us, and we've talked about in some previous webinars, adolescence is a time when, your perceptions of the police, of the law and law enforcement become fixed in our minds. And so these early negative and dehumanizing and physical encounters with the police really shape the course of that child's life as they transition into adulthood, in terms of how they deal with police officers in the future.
And I would add,
yeah, please.
I was just going to add, if you live in a community that's already over policed, chances are that you've seen this a lot, unfortunately, happening to your friends, to your family. And so as you're growing up in a community that's over policed, as you're growing up around police brutality of your family members and friends, and then being exposed to it on social media, in the media, that, for kids, when they have that interaction, that's the kind of behaviors you see in the form of this protest.
Absolutely. Such a good point. My goodness. What we want to do to really bring to life what Duci just explained, what she just laid out to us, we want to show one more video. And this one is probably the most intense of the ones that we've watched. So it's 3 minutes, just bear with it. Again, giving you the grace of understanding that this is difficult to watch. This is the video from the Ty Guruli case that I talked about at the very opening of the webinar. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, Ty Guruli was acquitted. He went to trial and he was acquitted. And so he was not, I'm just going to tell you in advance, he was not killed by the police, which is really critical. This is a very difficult video to watch. So let's just watch this for a moment. And this really drives home the physicality, right? The violence and the physicality associated with, Black children, or that Black children experience when they are when they attempt to assert themselves. So we'll play that video now.
Back up, please.
I just backed up.
Back up, away from here.
Calm down. That's harassment. Okay, can I ask you a question? What did my little brother do? He don't do nothing. He plays football for Roosevelt. Come on now. He don't drink, he don't smoke, he don't do nothing, bro.
What the fuck?
Why y'all doing that? Why y'all doing that?
Fucking pigs!
You're fucking pigs! What the fuck?
Fucking pigs!
Y'all ain't doing that for
Fucking
y'all. That's
pigs!
no reason.
Why you beast? Stop pulling his hair, you fucking pig!
Get down on the ground.
You fucking pig!
Calm down.
Fucking
Ty,
pig!
lay on the ground. Lay on the ground, Ty. Hey, I'm not touching y'all.
Fucking pig! Why is she punching him? Why is she punching him?
Why
are you punching him?
That's illegal.
Why are you
for
punching
y'all
him?
to do that. That's illegal.
Why are you
for y'all
punching
to
him?
do
What
that.
the fuck?
That's illegal.
Quit
For
standing in
what?
front of the
For
camera.
what? Can I ask you for what? What's the probability of cost? What's the probability of cost? What's the cost for that?
What the fuck?
What's the
Fucking
cost?
pig!
I'm not even stepping towards you.
Fucking pig!
What's the cost for that? What's the cost for that?
Stop pulling his fucking
What's the
hair!
fucking cost?
Get off his
That's
fucking
my
hair!
brother. What's the fucking cost? That's harassment.
Get off his fucking hair!
Fucking pig!
You guys need to cross back on the street or you're gonna go to jail.
This is legal. It's a sidewalk. I
Film
can film.
over
No,
there.
It's legal. Fucking pig, bro. You fucking pig.
Get back!
Bro, what the fuck? What the fuck?
Get back!
What the fuck? Why you hit him with the taser? What the fuck?
You're gonna go to stay where you're at, right there.
What the fuck?
Y'all saw my little brother.
Get back.
Y'all saw my fucking little
What the
brother.
fuck, you fucking pig?
Y'all some fucking pigs.
You fucking pig!
Some fucking pigs, nigga. Y'all some fucking pigs.
What the fuck?
That's harassment, nigga. Y'all legal for doing that.
What the
Please
fuck?
Tell me his charge. Tell me
What
his
is he getting
charge.
charged with?
Tell me. Look,
What is he getting charged with?
My
This
hands
is
up.
legal.
Y'all
It's a
can't
sidewalk.
do
I can
this.
stand
My
here.
hands are up.
It's
Y'all
completely
can't
legal.
shoot me. Y'all can't
It's
shoot
legal.
me. What I'm saying,
Quit standing in front of the camera.
No, fuck that. They
Quit
just
standing in front of my camera. Quit standing in front of my fucking camera.
Why the fuck they just
What the
my brother
fuck?
like that? Why
Okay,
the fuck they
these
just
guys
take
need
my
to go on
brother
the
like
other
that?
side of the road. If they don't, they're going in handcuffs.
It's
Go
legal.
handcuff me.
This is legal.
The other side of the road.
This is legal.
No, handcuff me.
This is legal.
Go to the other
This
side.
is legal.
Film
Don't
all
touch
you
me.
want.
Please don't touch me.
Get
Don't
out of
touch
the
me.
road.
Don't touch me. Don't touch me. Don't fucking touch me. Don't touch me. Don't touch me.
Get out of the street.
Anybody that doesn't want to go to jail, get out of the street.
That's my little brother. Why y'all tasing him like that?
The
Why
fuck?
the fuck y'all tasing him like that?
Get out of the street.
Why the fuck y'all tasing him
Get out
like
of the
that?
street. You
Why
need to
the
go.
Wow. It's so extraordinarily painful. I fully recognize that. One of the reasons that we wanted to show that, if you remember, right? Remember, this is the story that I told at the very beginning of the webinar. The only thing he did was when the officers clapped their hands at him and said, hey, he turned around and said, don't fucking clap at me. That's it. That incident, that moment went all the way to what you just saw right there with him being tased. So much so, people were terrified that he had been shot. They didn't even realize that it was a tasing instead of him being shot. That's how quickly these escalate. And it is so incredibly important as we try to educate folks about youth police encounters and how they evolve, that folks really understand the gravity of this. I indicated Ty Guruli really had a judge who understood this. She acquitted Ty. Unfortunately, Ty's brother, Giovanni, you can hear his voice throughout the 3-minute clip here. Giovanni went to trial in adult court for this incident, and he was found guilty of misdemeanor interfering with a police officer and a resisting arrest charge. And that was Judge Cheryl Albrecht, who sentenced him to 64 hours of community service and 2 years of probation. And I feel like everybody who had a hand in this should be called out, named for the way this went down, the police and the way the state actors, the court actors responded after that. And we cannot forget that both boys, Ty and Giovanni and their mother, there are interviews with their mother, will live with the trauma of this incident for the rest of their lives. Okay, really, really powerful for us to understand. So again, we could talk about this video, for hours, but before, I want us to transition into a call to action, right? What's our strategy? How do we move forward? But before I do that, is there any, one reaction that Duci or Dr. Stanford have to this video?
I mean, for me, I had a very visceral reaction. Like, my heart was beating quickly as I was watching it. And that's me as an observer. Just think about how it feels for our young people who do not know if they could be killed or, seriously injured with police in that interaction, not knowing what their fate will be. And, I had that physical reaction. Just think about that young person and how, it is for the person who is dealing with the police, but also that family member who's watching and feeling so helpless.
That's right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really the frustration of the realization that you can't set boundaries. Number one, you can't protect your peace or your space or remind people of the level of respect that you have as a Black person, because saying don't clap at me is dehumanizing. You're clapping at me like I'm an animal. In that whole sector, and me voicing that or setting that boundary can trigger this level of interaction is, it's really frustrating to see the way it pulls the hope and, the stands out of Black kids and especially Black boys of telling them what they are and what they're going to end up in this society.
Wow. So painful. So true. So true. Just stealing the hope, you said, out of kids. That's just so true. So let's, as we moved, to the last segment of this webinar, which we want to focus on the resistance, right? The call to action. And so let me turn to Duci and just, what sort of words of wisdom or advice do you have for defenders or other youth advocates who have to, or who are working with young people in this space, right? Who have been charged maybe with contempt of cop, or who have come home from school and told you about these encounters. So what do we do first, I guess, as lawyers, and then maybe as parents or as community advocates?
I think one is that we have to honor this form of protest for youth and, give our youth a voice. I think litigating these matters, and grateful to you, Chris, for all that you've provided in terms of the resources, materials, the annotated bibliographies, experts like Dr. Stanford, who we can call in our cases, who can testify to how someone with a disability interacts with the police, given the disability that they may have. I think sometimes, I know attorneys can be sort of dismissive of this, or say that the odds are stacked up against us. It's easier to just sort of resolve this case, in a way that may be the best deal that they think they can get for their client. But a lot of times really pushing back against this and litigating the cases, but also giving voices to our clients. I had a similar case like this a year or so ago, where a situation escalated and, assault and battery, police officer disturbing the peace disorderly. And we went to trial, and it was a three co-defendant case, and all three of the young people testified, and they did an excellent job telling their story, and really, was compelling. Unfortunately, the jury did not go in our favor and found all three delinquent. We're going through an appeal process now, but in talking to our clients afterwards, they were heartbroken at the decision, but also felt empowered in their ability to testify and stand up against the police. The Commonwealth in our jurisdiction, it's the Commonwealth, paraded in like 7 police officers to testify about what happened, and to have our clients have the ability to get up on the stand and tell their side of the story, even though it didn't work out in the way that we wanted to, still felt empowering. So really giving our clients the ability to tell their story and really pushing back and litigating these cases using the resources that we have and the experts, as I said, like Dr. Stanford, I think is really important.
Yeah, all of those pieces of advice are really, really helpful. And I love your story of your client having that opportunity to testify. I imagine, not even I imagine, having, representing kids myself, the ways in which them getting the opportunity to speak out is cathartic, right? It's, it's therapeutic in many ways for young people. So I really appreciate that. Dr. Stanford, do you have additional thoughts about what we should do, as youth advocates, as defenders, or even just people who care about young people to make sure that judges, decision makers, teachers, police officers, understand what's happening and protect them from contempt of cop charges?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with everything Duci said, and especially that part about not automatically defaulting to plea deals or pleas. I think because a lot of times it tells the youth that, we're not willing to fight for, what they said, or what that their opinion or their judgment is not good enough or strong enough in those processes. But there's also a saying, which I'm sure a lot of us can probably relate to, is that all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And so keeping in mind that an expert is not just an expert. There's levels, and there's levels to this. There's differences in the type of experts. And so you got to be very intentional as defenders and, judges, that you are pulling in experts that not only understands just the communication and the cognitive side, but can recognize the cultural differences, that can recognize, the disconnects or the trauma. And that's going to be, you doing the work. It's very effective to do the work, and then also pushing back on that. And so even though, like Duci said, the case didn't go the way they wanted, the more it is done, the more we'll have the awareness, and it will eventually change things that we're hearing about it more. Psychology didn't become a forefront in the legal system until psychology became a forefront. It came from the continuous pushing. So the recognition around language impairments and communication disorders is going to continue to have to be a push that everybody, jumps in on, and make sure that they're fighting for the youth and understanding development.
Oh, I really, really love that. Especially there's so many pieces of what you both said that are great, but this idea of, like, even when we lose, we continue to make these kinds of arguments, litigate these issues, bring in experts, because we're gradually educating folks, right? And then it becomes commonplace. And you're absolutely right. There was a time when people thought we were crazy to talk about adolescent development, but we went from crazy pants to possible to probable to precedent in the Supreme Court, as our dear friend, an appellate defender, Amanda Powell, would say. Really, really important to keep pushing these issues. I also like this notion of interviewing our kids, right? So in order to give voice to kids, we as defenders have to conduct those interviews differently, right? It's not, we get so caught up as lawyers in asking questions about the immediate legal case. We also need to be asking about their experience with policing in the past, their feelings and fears about policing in the past, their conversations with their family members and friends about policing. All of that, we've got to dig a little deeper if we want to be able to give voice to that. We have a webinar coming up in 2 months on chapter 9, which is policing as trauma. And so we'll get back to some of this, but this is really important, even as we're defending these contempt of cop type charges, to be drawing upon our clients' understanding and perception and fears associated with this. It's really important. I also want to pick up on what both of you have talked about, this notion of experts, right? And how do we go about finding experts? And you started talking about not all experts are equal. And so how do we figure out what we need? Are there records, school records? Like, what's sort of the process that you recommend? And I imagine people might want to be calling you. So if you don't mind, we might put your email address, if you're okay with that, in the chat.
Yes, I appreciate that. So I would say the notice or the red flag that always pops up is when you're seeing things like a psychological evaluation has been done. 9 times out of 10, when you're seeing that a person has done the whisk and the woodcock, or there's some IQ concerns, there is always a language disorder present. And so the other thing that just came to my mind is keeping in mind that even though you may not have won the battle in family court, there also is a part of the due process law where holding us accountable as professionals and as clinicians, we also do a disservice. So a lot of times I'm also talking with defendants about the fact that even though he had an IEP, his IEP didn't address his needs. Or even though he had an IEP, they did not give him the services that was necessary for what I'm seeing per this evaluation. And so there's a whole nother way you can take it where once we start to hold them accountable, that might make a change here. It's a cyclical process. So looking at the records, the academic records, in my research, I found that 95% of the incarcerated men that I treat in the carceral space right now, the last grade they completed was 10th or 11th grade. That's a big concern, and they're serving life sentences now. So, looking at the academic records and requesting the academic records, the parents are always going to be able to get it faster than you all. So if you need it, ask the parents to get it. But, getting the academic records and then looking for anytime there's an IEP, there should automatically be, some type of discussion around what was on there, and not only taking the old data, because somebody can have a disorder that is exacerbated in a situation, or they've tracked on more disorders. So getting a speech and language pathologist that one specializes in child language disorders specifically, or if it's something for brain, you want to get a speech and language pathologist that specializes in neurological impairments, but you want to get that person in that specialized area. And then also finding out about their multiculturalism training. Every program doesn't train in multiculturalism. There are some that will perpetuate biases and implicit or cognitive biases that can impact your approach, but reaching out there. And then like Professor Henning has said, if you're not sure about the expert in your state, then you can always definitely reach out to me and I can put you on the track of what you should be looking for or interviewing them for in that process. And so, that part, clarity wise, any speech and language pathologist that has specific skills can do a speech and language evaluation. However, at this time, only myself can do the forensic type of evaluation, but in your state, there is hopefully a speech and language pathologist that can do it.
Yeah, we have a unique speech and language pathologist in our midst. So we thank you for, which is a even rare breed, I don't know, not to call you a breed, but a rare expertise of forensic speech and language pathology. So it's really, with children specifically, it's really important. So we did drop your email address and in the chat, and this is just sort of very helpful thoughts about what to look for, what questions to ask, by reading that IEP and looking for certain diagnosis that might lead you to the right experts, right? You could, yeah, go ahead, please, Dr. Stanford.
And you just made a really good note, and I think Duci has said it, and I would say it. Also keep in mind that even though a youth is considered an adult, that practice of child language disorders is about the fact that a person who hasn't had their disorders treated as a youth can become an adult with those same disorders. So reaching out to a juvenile, me as a juvenile, doesn't mean I only do the kids. It just means that their disorder was present from a young age. And so it still needs to be addressed.
That's powerful. I actually didn't realize that this notion that an untreated diagnosis or untreated condition in childhood perpetuates to adulthood, still, right, has an impact on their ability and capacity to engage with police officers. Very, very useful. Good. So as we come to a close, we always like to say a word about policy reform, right? So we've talked about individual advocacy. Duci, you're a defender, but defenders have a role to play in policy reform and systemic reform on this issue. What policy changes should youth advocates be advancing or supporting to protect young people from these contempt of cop arrests? Any thoughts on that one?
Well, there's been a lot, I think, in a lot of different states on policing and policing practices and how to interact with young people, you know, certain trainings around de-escalation techniques. So I think supporting those measures and being involved, being a voice at the table, because I think having a defender voice at the table is so important. I think another piece of this, people love data. So I think being able to track data, we talked a little bit about over policing of certain communities. If we have data in terms of, you know, these offenses, the cover charges, the disorderlies, the disturbings, the resisting arrest, and who are actually being charged with these offenses, that's powerful when, you know, you're in court and you can say to a judge, in this particular community where, you know, kids of color make X percentage, this is the number of arrests for resisting or disorderly. So I think being able to use each other as resources in our communities to be able to track the data, even I think nationally, is really important. And being able to really change the narrative about our Black and Brown youth. And, you know, we've talked about all the different resources that are out there that talk about how our kids are being perceived to be more, you know, dangerous or, you know, older in age or more criminal behavior. It makes me think back to that video that you showed where it sort of was a juxtaposition to the cartoon of a white child versus a Black child and how their behavior is perceived differently. So really working to change the narrative inside the courtroom, but outside of the courtroom as well.
All three very, very helpful points. Thank you so much, Duci. And, you know, Dr. Stanford, you know, any final parting words of wisdom, especially around like just overall policy reform or, you know, anything that needs to happen, you know, to make sort of the world a better place for Black children who rightfully want to speak out?
Yeah, so again, I'll jump over here with Duci. She's all the things I want to say. Absolutely. Police training, 100%. Again, keeping in mind that they get over 24 hours of weaponry training, and they don't get any training on cognitive and communication disorders. So police training, I know you all, Professor Henning, have brought me in on a more mature Miranda discussion in DC, but definitely policy around increasing or changing the wording in the Miranda right discussion for youth. And then I have like my own personal one that I think is important, which is the court interpreters recognition. And, you know, the wording recognizes speech and languages, but there's never a time where a person with a hearing impairment or a learning disability is able to say, I don't understand, I need an interpreter, and you call a speech and language pathologist. It's only if you speak a different language. So even policy around allowing the advocacy of saying I need an SLP or whatever it is in the court system to help me understand this process is something that I think should be addressed policy-wise.
Oh, wow, I so love that. I will say this, I had totally forgotten this, but one case I had, it was a jury trial in adult court. And we hired a speech and language pathologist. We actually had contested competency. We said that our client was incompetent to stand trial. The judge ruled against us, but said that we could propose accommodations. And one of the accommodations that we requested was for a speech and language pathologist to sit at the table and like help us navigate, help, you know, slow down the trial, interpret wherever necessary. And yeah, because the adult client had a speech and language disorder diagnosis. So thank you for that. I will close us out by saying this. You all, thank you both so much. This has been such an incredibly important conversation. I really don't think that most people understand what is happening in police youth encounters in Black and Brown communities. And so we have to educate the community and the state actors on all of these issues: adolescent trauma responses, adolescent protest responses, youth with disability, and how all of these responses are distorted by racial bias. And so until, you know, look, education and change is essential if we want to protect children, Black and Brown children, from physical harm, if we want to protect police officers, if we want to protect the legal rights of children, and if we want to reduce the number of children who are arrested and prosecuted unnecessarily. So thank you so much. I'm just so honored to be with you all. I learned so much today. I was typing notes while I was listening to you all. That's a panel, when you can take notes while you're moderating a conversation. So I really appreciate you all for all that you shared. Thank you.
Just jumping in also to thank Professor Chris Henning. I hope you all can see all the gratitude that you're getting in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us today, for taking time for this conversation. Duci, Dr. Stanford, Chris Henning, and to all of you who joined us. Thanks for being with us, everyone. Until next month.
Thank you.